Hey guys, this is Allie with Cruise Blog. Last month, I took a bucket list cruise through Africa with Norwegian Cruise Line on board Norwegian Dawn. While this cruise ship was one of the oldest in the cruise line's fleet at 22 years old, the unique itinerary was one that I simply couldn't resist. Even better, the cruise fare was extremely affordable compared to other African cruise options. The 12-night itinerary on Norwegian Dawn featured ports of call throughout Africa, including Mauritius, Madagascar, and South Africa. While most cruises visit popular destinations throughout the Caribbean, Alaska, and Europe, some cruise lines offer more exotic itineraries like this. These bucket list itineraries visit unique places around the world with stops to off-the-beaten-path ports of call. As someone who's been to Cozumel and Nassau more times than I can count, the idea of cruising to Africa was exciting. Instead of drinking fruity cocktails on the pool deck, I booked excursions that would take me on exciting safari adventures throughout Africa each day. With some quick convincing, my friend Rosina wanted to join me on this wild adventure for a girls' trip. This wasn't your ordinary cruise, as this trip had a lot of planning and logistics involved. Just like most cruises, not everything goes exactly as planned. While there were some unexpected challenges during our vacation, I don't have any regrets about booking an African safari cruise with Norwegian Cruise Line. So here's everything that went right and wrong, along with why I wouldn't hesitate to book the same cruise again. To start, one of the reasons I wanted to take a cruise instead of a land-based trip was the opportunity to comfortably visit multiple countries throughout Africa. There are many different ways to do an African safari, and most of these are not by cruise ship. Many will camp or stay in a reserve doing game drives from sunup to sundown, looking for wild animals throughout the park. Taking a cruise has its limitations, such as time constraints, weather delays, and lack of flexibility. Although I've been fortunate to see much of the world, I had actually only visited Africa once before, and this was during my semester abroad in college on Semester at Sea. My only attempt at an African safari was a total bust in which we drove 13 hours into the depths of Senegal, and we only saw one animal, which was a caged leopard. After this immensely disappointing experience, I wanted to have some redemption and experience a true African safari. I define myself as cautiously adventurous when it comes to traveling. Because of this, I was drawn to the idea of cruising since it was familiar and comfortable. Being able to return to a safe place each day on Norwegian Dawn with clean water, air conditioning, and familiar food was priceless to me. So for this African cruise, I booked as many safari excursions as possible through Norwegian Cruise Line. After making a reservation on board Norwegian Dawn, I started to research the best safari options for each port. With my research, I concluded that it would be best to plan our safaris with Norwegian Cruise Line. Since I had never sailed to this area of the world before, I was not confident about booking excursions with a third party, so although they were more expensive, I did feel more comfortable with this option. When excursions were released on the cruise planner in the summer, I booked as many safaris as I could for the ports. This included 3 safaris in 4x4 vehicles, which is a classic open-aired car used for game drives in Africa. Each safari was around $200 and included 2 hours of driving around the reserve or national park. The safaris would be at the end of the itinerary in South Africa. The beginning of the cruise, though, had some unexpected incidents, from the embarkation in Mauritius to a missed port in Madagascar. Boarding the Norwegian Dawn in Mauritius was one of the worst embarkation experiences that I've ever had. Taking an African cruise is very different than other cruises, let's just say. In this way, it's important to have realistic expectations, and I was prepared for some non-customary cruise experiences because of this. Arriving to the cruise port in Mauritius, we found a giant tent in place of a traditional cruise terminal, a long line weaved outside in the hot African sun. There was nowhere to drop off our luggage, so we had to haul it around with us inside a hot tent. Many of the older guests struggled to stand in the hot tent for hours, which is very understandable. It took up to 3 hours to check in and board the Norwegian Dawn. Another disappointment came on day 4 of our cruise when we couldn't dock in our first port of Madagascar due to weather. The low tides prevented Norwegian Dawn from safely docking, so we spent the day at sea instead. At this point in the itinerary, I wondered whether I would regret taking a cruise instead of a land-based trip. Because I had traveled so far, at this point in the trip, I felt like I hadn't seen much and I hadn't done any safaris, so it kind of felt like it wasn't worthwhile at this point. Being on a cruise, you do have less flexibility and control of your vacation because you're at the mercy of the weather and the decisions that are made by the cruise line and your ship's captain. I also struggled with anxiety as we made our way to South Africa. I feared that we would have further challenges and changes to our itinerary that would lead to more disappointment. If I had traveled so far to Africa for another failed safari attempt, this really would have been devastating for me and my wallet. Fortunately, we arrived to South Africa without issue, and I excitedly embarked on our first safari excursion. Our first stop in South Africa was Richards Bay, where we had scheduled a 4x4 game drive in Hule Hule Park. This is not how you pronounce it, but I absolutely, for the life of me, cannot pronounce how the locals pronounce it. This drive was around 2 hours from the cruise port to the national park, where we would get in the 4x4 vehicle for our safari, and I was giddy like a kid on Christmas morning getting into that 4x4. With our safari guide, we started to drive around the Hule National Park, which is one of the oldest nature reserves in Africa. Since this was not a zoo and in fact was the wilderness, you never know what you might see. We immediately saw zebras in the distance and water buffaloes right off the side of the dirt road. Later during our drive, we also saw an elephant, which was considered a rare sighting at this park. Other animals included impalas and warthogs, although we could have also seen lions, leopards, and rhinos at this park. The 2 hours in the 4x4 absolutely flew by. I could have stayed out there for 2 more hours, if not more, while driving around looking for animals. I really couldn't stop smiling the entire day. It just felt surreal. Our second safari excursion was to Addo Elephant Park, although Norwegian messed up my original reservation. When booking our second excursion to Addo Elephant Park, I originally booked the excursion in a 4x4 for the game drive. After achieving gold latitude status, though, back in October, I qualified for a new 15% shore excursion discount through Norwegian. So when rebooking our excursions to apply the 15% discount, Norwegian said originally that the 4x4 excursion was available to rebook because they technically had to cancel the original one and rebook. But when they went to apply the discount and rebook the tour in the 4x4, they said it was no longer available. Because of this, we could only do the Elephant Park by a coach bus through the cruise line. And honestly, this was very disappointing to me initially, as an African safari is undoubtedly best in a 4x4 open-aired vehicle. When we arrived to the Elephant Park, though, I heard from fellow cruisers that their 4x4 excursions had also been canceled by the cruise line, but they were only notified on the first day of the cruise. So I was very grateful that we were on the coach tour because every other excursion was sold out and those people were out of luck. Arriving to the Addo Elephant Park, my disdain faded even further when I saw that the temperature was going to be 108 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Being in the coach bus meant that we had air conditioning, so I stopped complaining after learning that. During our drive in the coach bus, we saw herds of elephants wandering around the park. At one point, the elephants walked right in front of our bus on their way to a watering hole. It was so unbelievable, like something that you see in the movies, and I was speechless. Even now thinking about it, I get chills. We saw upwards of probably 50 elephants during our drive around the park, along with so many zebras. I asked our guide if this was normal, and they said sometimes they come to the Addo Elephant Park and they don't see anything, and that this was the most that they had seen in a long time. So I was feeling very lucky for that. The herds of elephants were wandering around the park and they were bathing in the water. Although I was initially disappointed that Norwegian had messed up our original excursion, I had no complaints about the tour because we saw so many elephants in the wild and we were just grateful to be on the coach bus with air conditioning. Later in the cruise, I was nervous that our final safari would be canceled in Mossel Bay, South Africa due to weather and tendering conditions, but this luckily wasn't the case. The final safari that we had booked was a 4x4 game drive in Botslikop, which is a private game reserve near Mossel Bay, South Africa. After already missing one port in our itinerary due to weather, I was nervous about missing our final safari because of the weather again. The seas were really rough while sailing to Mossel Bay, so I was anxious most of the evening about whether or not we would actually make it there. I've also been on Norwegian cruises where they canceled tender ports because of the weather condition, so because of this, I was a little bit on edge. However, I was pleasantly surprised to wake up to a beautiful morning in Mossel Bay. The weather was actually so calm that we could see seals jumping in and out of the water during sunrise and even during our tender ashore. Our final safari was the best of the 3, although every safari really was incredible in their own way. During the safari, we immediately saw 2 giraffes and so many zebras. Additionally, our 4x4 vehicle drove right up to a rhino. I could not believe how close we were able to get to such a massive wild animal. This was truly a pinch me moment. We were also able to see the reserve's cheetahs at the end of the safari. Although we couldn't find any of the lions, I learned that cheetahs are rather friendly to humans and sometimes they are a little bit shy, which explains why they seemed very unbothered by our 4x4 vehicle. So, although I loved all 3 of our safaris, I will say that Norwegian Dawn's shore excursion team was a little disorganized. Despite these excellent excursions through Norwegian Cruise Line, I was surprised by the apparent disorganization of the ship's shore excursion team. Upon arriving to the theater each morning for our excursions, the team never seemed to be on the same page. One morning we would receive our excursion number and our sticker right away, while the other mornings we'd be instructed to do the opposite and sit in a certain area and then receive our stickers right before getting off the ship. It didn't help that many of the other cruisers refused to follow the instructions from the excursion staff, so that just caused more confusion. And this was especially true during our face-to-face immigration in South Africa, where there was actually people who were fighting in the immigration line because of the disorganization. I concluded that many guests were older and chose to take this itinerary because it was a bucket list trip for them. And this seemingly contributed to an emotionally heightened environment on board. Everyone wanted to be the first ones off the ship to experience as much as Africa as possible and have the best safaris as possible. Because of this, many guests on the excursions didn't follow instructions, or they complained about how the excursion was operating. Regardless, me and Rosina had a great time on our excursions and our safaris through Norwegian Cruise Line. I have no regrets with booking these tours through the cruise line, and I would do this again on the same itinerary. Booking the excursions through Norwegian Cruise Line also really helped simplify the planning process for this big trip. Going to Africa for a safari was always on my bucket list, but I had no idea where to begin the planning process. Most people will visit Africa on a land trip for a safari, but the planning can be quite tedious. The continent is huge, and there are seemingly endless choices for where to take a safari. Taking a cruise provides an entirely different experience, though. For example, you'll be able to visit more destinations along the coast of Africa that might not receive the same fanfare as big-name reserves like Kruger National Park. In addition, you can cover more ground on a cruise ship because you'll be visiting many different ports of call throughout your itinerary. When taking a land-based trip to Africa, you will likely only have time to visit a few different reserves. Visiting multiple destinations in Africa allowed me to see a variety of reserves. Each one is very unique and offers its own distinct wildlife and experience. Finally, those who are looking to visit multiple reserves across Africa on a land trip will need to do a lot of planning. While this isn't impossible, taking a cruise provides a lot of simplification for logistics. Once you've booked your cruise, you can simply book excursions directly through the cruise line. These have already been researched and vetted by the cruise line, so you can rest assured that it will likely be a pretty good experience. But if you're someone looking to be totally immersed in the African safari culture and wildlife, a cruise might not be the right fit for you. However, for me, I thought it was a perfect balance. Taking an African safari cruise is not for everyone, and this type of cruise definitely has its limitations, such as limited time in port, lack of flexibility, and weather problems. In addition, Norwegian Cruise Line's African itineraries are offered during the summer, which is storm and rain season. Most recommended doing African safaris during the dry season from June to August because of this. Additionally, during port stays, you will be visiting reserves during the heat of the day. This is when the animals tend to rest, while they are more active in the mornings and evenings. Those who choose to do a land-based trip for safaris have more flexibility for their game drives from sunrise to sunset. I was only able to visit the reserves in the late morning and early afternoon, although I still saw many animals at each reserve, so this really wasn't a problem for us. Moreover, your safaris will be limited to the proximity of reserves and parks that are on your itinerary. While I did not consider this a major limitation, some people might be looking to visit the bigger reserves that can only be found further inland. While our cruise on Norwegian Dawn certainly had its hiccups, I would not hesitate to do it again, and that is me being honest. Personally, taking an African safari cruise was the perfect balance between adventurous days and having comfortability each night on board. I loved returning to my cozy cruise cabin each night with the excitement of a new destination each day. Being able to visit so many diverse reserves with the convenience of a cruise was priceless. Alright everybody, that's all I have today about my African safari cruise. Comment below if you've ever considered doing an African safari cruise or whether you would be planning one in the future because you loved this video so much. Alright everybody, thanks for tuning in today. Be sure to like and subscribe to Cruise Blog so you can be notified every time we have a new video. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, happy cruising.